There's a moment that most people don't notice. They completely miss it. It happens right before falling asleep. Your body begins to shut down, but your mind doesn't quite follow. You're still aware. You're not fully awake, but you're not fully asleep either. You're just there, quietly existing. And if you stay in that state long enough, something starts to feel a little weird, a little off, because you realize that you're still observing, even though your body isn't really doing anything anymore. So then the question shows up, not all at once, just very quietly. What exactly is doing the observing? And if that part of you can exist without movement, without sight, without input, then where is it actually happening? In the early 1980s, a report was written for the U.S. Army. Not about weapons, not about surveillance, about consciousness. The document is real. It was declassified years later, and it's publicly available. It's called The Analysis and Assessment of the Gateway Process. And when you read it, it doesn't sound at all like science fiction. It feels like somebody's trying to explain something that they don't fully understand. But they also can't ignore. The report was written by Lieutenant Colonel Wayne McDonnell. His job wasn't to prove anything. It was to evaluate a training system, something developed outside the military that claimed it could change the way the mind operates. Not metaphorically, but in a measurable, physical way. And that's where things start to get a little strange, because the report itself doesn't begin with belief. It begins with structure. It tries to connect the idea of consciousness to energy and frequency and vibration. Concepts that already exist in physics. Not abstract ideas, not spiritual language, but actual frameworks that are already used to describe how reality behaves at a fundamental level. And that's part of what makes the document feel different. It doesn't read like someone reaching. It reads like someone trying to translate. Taking a set of experiences and asking, is there any existing model that could even begin to explain this? Now, to be clear, this isn't the CIA saying, we have figured out consciousness. That's not what this is. And it's important to keep that in mind. What this is someone inside the government system taking a set of experiences seriously enough to try to map them. Not validate them, not confirm them, but also not to dismiss them. Just map them. And that alone is very interesting because most of the time, experiences that don't fit neatly into established science get ignored. But this report doesn't really do that. Instead, it leans into the discomfort a little bit. It acknowledges that something is happening, even if the explanation isn't clear. And in doing that, the report makes a quiet shift. Instead of asking, what does the brain produce? it starts asking, what is the brain interacting with? And those are two very different questions, because one assumes origin, the other assumes connection. If consciousness is something the brain creates, then it should be limited by the brain. When the brain slows down, consciousness should fade. When the brain shuts off, consciousness should stop. That's the standard model. That's what most of us are taught, whether we think about it that way or not. But the Gateway Report, at least in the way it explores the idea, doesn't fully settle there. It introduces the possibility, carefully, that the brain might not be the source. It might be more like a receiver or a filter, something that tunes rather than generates. And if that's the case, then consciousness might not be confined to the physical body in the way we assume. Now again, this is not presented as any kind of proven fact. It's presented as a model, a way of looking at things that could potentially explain why certain experiences happen the way they do. Experiences like deep meditative states, experiences like altered awareness, experiences where people report feeling separate from their physical bodies. The report doesn't say those experiences are external. It doesn't say they're internal either. It just acknowledges that they exist. And then it asks, if these experiences are consistent, what kind of system would allow for them? That's the tone of the whole document. It's not certainty. It's not dismissal. It's just careful curiosity. And that's part of what makes it unsettling in a very soft way, because it doesn't quite give you something to push against. It doesn't tell you what to believe. It just opens a door and then it steps back. Now, there's a layer to this, the context. This wasn't written in isolation. This was during the Cold War, a time when both the United States and the Soviet Union were exploring anything that might give them an edge, including things that today might sound a little outside the norm. Remote viewing, psychological influence, altered states of awareness. Not because they were accepted as real, but because they weren't fully understood. And when something isn't fully understood, but shows patterns, it tends to get studied, even cautiously, even skeptically. So the gateway process ended up being looked at through that lens, not as a belief system, but as a potential tool. And that framing matters a lot because it explains why a document like this exists at all. It wasn't written to inspire. It wasn't written to convince the public of anything. It was written to answer a very specific question. Is there something here worth paying attention to? And the answer, at least in the tone of the report, isn't a clear yes or no. It's more like, there might be something there. We just don't fully understand what it is yet. And that kind of answer doesn't resolve anything. It doesn't give any kind of closure. It just leaves the question open. And maybe that's the part that lingers. Because once you consider the possibility, even briefly, that consciousness might not be entirely contained within the body, it's hard to unask that question. It changes how you look at certain moments, those in-between states, those times when you feel aware but not fully grounded. Those brief experiences where something feels slightly out of place, but not enough to explain. What do you make of all this? Let us know in the comments below wherever you're listening. Reach out to us here at the Midnight Drive. Our hotline is 402-610-2836. I would love to hear your thoughts on the gateway process, but I would also love to hear any of your personal stories. Weird, wonderful, something completely bonkers. Let me know. 402-610-2836. 36. We're going to carry on talking about the gateway process in our next segment here on the Midnight Drive. The system at the center of the gateway report didn't come from a lab. It came from one person, a man called Robert Monroe. He wasn't trained as a neuroscientist. He didn't come from academia. He worked in radio, production, broadcasting, sound, which, at first, doesn't seem connected at all. But the longer that you sit with it, the more it starts to make sense. Because radio, at its core, is about signals, frequencies moving through space, information that exists, whether you're tuned in or not. And all you really need is the right receiver. In the late 1950s, Monroe started having experiences he couldn't explain. They weren't dramatic at first. They didn't come with any answers, just a feeling that something was off. He described moments where, as he was laying down, he felt like he was separating from his body. Not in a dreamlike way, not symbolic, but spatial. Like his awareness had shifted locations. At first, he assumed something was wrong, some kind of medical issue, something neurological, something that needed to be fixed. And that's a very normal reaction, because when your sense of self, your sense of who you are, suddenly changes, it doesn't feel philosophical. It feels like something is breaking. So he did what most people do. He looked for explanations, medical tests, evaluations, but nothing came back abnormal. No clear cause, no diagnosis that explained the experience. But the experiences didn't stop. They kept happening, sometimes randomly, sometimes in similar conditions, usually when his body was relaxed, but his mind was still alert. That same space we talked about earlier, right on the edge of sleep. So instead of pushing it away, he started paying attention. He began documenting what he felt. Not just the experience itself, but everything around it. The time of day, his physical state, his mental state, what led up to it, what pulled him out of it. He was looking for patterns. And over time, those patterns started to become more consistent. The experiences weren't identical. They weren't completely random either. There was structure built in. Subtle, but repeatable. And that's when the questions shifted from, what is happening to me, to, is there a way to enter this state on purpose? That's a different kind of question, because now you're not just observing something, you're interacting with it, trying to recreate it, which means you need variables, conditions, inputs. And this is where Monroe's background starts to matter, because instead of approaching any of this through biology, he approached it through sound. If consciousness or awareness could shift under certain conditions, maybe those conditions could be influenced, not forced, but guided. And sound is one of the most direct ways to influence the brain. We already know that rhythm can change state. Music can change mood. Repetition can alter attention. So Monroe started experimenting with frequencies, specifically something called binaural beats. The concept is simple. You play one tone in one ear and a slightly different tone in the other. Your brain doesn't just hear two tones. It processes the difference between them. And in doing that, it begins to shift its own activity to match that pattern. This isn't theoretical either. Binaural beats are a real phenomenon. You can find them on Spotify. You can find them on Apple Music. You can find them on Qobuz. You can find them on YouTube. You can find them anywhere that you enjoy music. Just type in binaural beats, B-I-N-A-U-R-A-L, beats, B-E-A-T-S. They have been studied. They can influence brainwave states like relaxation, focus, even sleep cycles. What Monroe was interested in was whether those shifts could go even further, not just calming the mind, but changing how awareness itself feels. So we started building structured audio tracks, layered tones, carefully timed patterns, designed not just to relax the body, but to guide the mind into very specific states. And over time, this developed into what he called hemisync, short for hemispheric synchronization. The idea was that under normal conditions, the left and right hemispheres of the brain operate with some level of separation. Different functions, different processing styles. But under certain conditions, they could be brought into alignment, operating in perfect sync. And according to Monroe, that synchronized state was the doorway. Not to something external necessarily, but to a different mode of perception. Now again, we got to stay grounded here. Hemisync is a real method. People have used it. It does affect brainwave activity. That part is documented. What's less clear is how far those effects go, because this is where we move from measurable things into reported experiences, and those two things aren't always the same. At the Monroe Institute, people began going through structured sessions, listening to these audio patterns in controlled environments, usually lying down, eyes closed, body relaxed, mind alert, and many of them reported something similar. Not identical, but similar. A shift in awareness, a sense that their physical body was no longer the center of their experience. Some described it as floating, not upward necessarily, just unanchored. Others described it as expanding, like their sense of self was no longer contained within a single point. And some didn't describe movement at all, just a very clear awareness, without the usual reference points. No weight, no position, just presence. Now, this is where it's very easy to jump to conclusions. So let's not do that. These are reported experiences. They feel real. They're often described in consistent ways, but that doesn't automatically tell us what's happening. It could be the brain generating a highly immersive internal state. Sure, it could be a form of lucid dreaming. It could be something closer to dissociation. Or it could just be something that we don't fully understand yet. And the honest answer is, we really don't know. The Gateway Report doesn't claim certainty here. It doesn't say, this is what's happening. It says, these are the conditions, these are the outcomes that people are describing. And then it tries to connect those outcomes to broader models, energy, frequency, resonance. But it never fully closes the loop, and maybe it can't. Because once you start dealing with subjective experience, you're working with something that doesn't always fit into clean measurements. You can measure brain activity, you can measure heart rate, you can measure patterns, but you can't directly measure what it feels like to be aware. You can only listen to how people describe it. And when enough people describe something in similar ways, it becomes difficult to ignore. Not because it proves anything, but because it suggests that something consistent is happening, even if the explanation isn't clear. And that's where Monroe's work sits. Not fully accepted, not fully dismissed, somewhere in between. A structured attempt to explore something that most people only experience accidentally, if at all. And that's part of what makes it all linger, because it raises a quiet possibility that those in-between moments, those states right before sleep, those brief shifts in awareness might not be random. They might be accessible. You're listening to The Midnight Drive, and tonight we're talking about the gateway process. So what does this actually feel like? Not in theory, not in report, but in the moment itself. When people talk about these states, they usually don't start with anything dramatic. There's no sudden shift, no clear beginning. It's very subtle. It almost starts the same way. The body begins to fall asleep. Muscles loosen. Breathing slows. The small, constant adjustments your body makes throughout the day stop. And there's a point when you realize you're still aware. That's usually the first thing that people notice. Not movement, not separation, just awareness still present, even though the body is starting to disappear from focus. And that word disappear doesn't mean gone. It just means less defined, less central. Like your body is still there, but it's no longer where your attention is anchored. For most people, this is where sleep takes over. You drift, you lose the thread, and that's it. But sometimes you don't. Sometimes you stay there. And when you do, the experience starts to change. People describe a kind of heaviness, not necessarily uncomfortable, just dense, like your body is sinking into whatever it's resting on. At the same time, there's often a lightness, an awareness, almost like those two things are moving in opposite directions. Body getting heavier, awareness getting lighter. And then, sometimes, there's a sensation that's harder to describe, a vibration. Not necessarily something you hear, not necessarily something that you feel on the surface, more like an internal hum. Steady, low, consistent. Some people say it builds slowly. Others say it arrives all at once. But when it's there, it tends to hold. And this is usually the point when the experience either stops or shifts. Because that sensation, whatever it is, can feel unfamiliar enough to pull you out of the state. Your attention snaps back. Your body responds again, and it's over. But if it doesn't, if you stay with it, that's when things start to feel different. Some people describe a sense of movement, not physical movement, more like repositioning. Like your point of awareness is no longer lined up the same way. There's no clear direction, no sense of up or down, just a shift. And this is where language starts to break down a little bit. Because what people report next doesn't always translate cleanly. Some say they feel like they are above themselves, looking down. Others say they're somewhere else entirely. Not a physical location, but also not nothing. Just somewhere. And some people don't describe location at all. They describe a kind of awareness that isn't tied to a body anymore. No weight, no edges, no clear boundaries, just presence. Now, again, it's important to stay grounded here because this is where interpretation can take over. These experiences feel real. In the moment, they are real to the person having them. But that doesn't automatically tell us what's happening. It could be the brain creating a very convincing internal environment. We know the brain is capable of that. Dreams can feel real. Memories can feel immediate. Perception can shift in ways that don't match our external reality. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that the brain is changing how it processes input, reducing sensory signals, alerting spatial awareness, creating a state where the usual reference points for self and location just aren't there anymore. And when those reference points disappear, the experience can feel like movement or separation, even if nothing has physically changed. And then there's a third possibility, the one that the gateway report doesn't fully commit to. But it also doesn't ignore it. That awareness itself might not be confined to the body. Again, not proven, but something we can point to and measure directly, but something people describe in consistent ways. Across different contexts, different cultures, different time periods, that consistency doesn't prove anything. But it does make it harder to dismiss completely, and that's where this sits, right in that space between explanation and experience. Now, there are a few other details that show up often enough to notice. Time tends to behave differently. People describe losing track of it. Moments feel longer than they should, or shorter, sometimes both. There's also a sense of clarity. Not always, but often. Like awareness is sharper, even though the body is completely relaxed. And then there's something people sometimes call clicking out. It's not an official term, just something that shows up in descriptions. A moment where awareness seems to drop out and then return. But when it returns, something feels slightly different, like a layer has shifted. Again, difficult to define, hard to measure, but consistent enough that it keeps coming up. And then eventually, the experience ends, sometimes gradually, sometimes all at once. Awareness settles back into the body, sensation returns, movement comes back online, and you're left with a memory of something that didn't quite fit, something that felt real, but doesn't have a clean explanation. And for most people, that's where it stays, a one-time experience or something that happens occasionally. Easy to dismiss, easy to move past, but for others, it becomes something they return to. Not always intentionally, sometimes it just happens, that same space right before sleep, where awareness lingers a little bit longer than usual. And once you've noticed it, because even if you explain it in the most grounded way possible, as a brain state, as a shift in perception, there's still something about it that feels slightly out of place. Not extreme, not overwhelming, just unfamiliar enough to make you pause. And that pause is where the question comes back. What exactly is experiencing this? Because if your body is still and your senses are quiet, and yet awareness is still there, then what is it attached to? And maybe there's a simple answer. Maybe it's just the brain doing something complex. Something we'll fully understand eventually. That's possible, but right now, it's not completely mapped out. And the people who experience it don't always describe it like something internal. They describe it like something shifting, something moving, something separating. Again, not in a dramatic way, just slightly out of alignment. And that's enough to keep the question open. Because once you've felt that, even once, it's hard to fully go back to the idea that awareness is fixed in one place. It starts to feel a little more flexible, a little less contained. And whether that's an illusion or something more is still unclear, but the experience itself keeps happening. Have you ever experienced this? I would love to hear your stories. The first time that this ever occurred with me was probably when I was 4 or 5 years old. I was a pretty self-aware kid, and I used to kind of send myself spiraling into an existential crisis. I didn't have the vocabulary for it, but it really did feel so strongly, like the body and my awareness were literally separating themselves. Super weird experience. But again, Tell me about it. Leave me a message. The Midnight Drive, 402-610-2836. We're going to be wrapping up the theory in our next segment. So this is where things start to open up a little bit. Not into answers, but into possibilities. Because once you step back from the experience itself and look at how it's being interpreted, you start to see a pattern. Not a conclusion, just a direction. The Gateway Report leans into an idea that shows up in a lot of different places, that consciousness might not be something that the brain creates, but rather something the brain interacts with, something it tunes into, like a signal or a field. Now, that idea isn't new. Versions of it have existed in philosophy and physics and in different forms of thought for a very long time. But in the Gateway model, it's framed in a very specific way as something that could be influenced through state, through frequency, through alignment. Not controlled completely, but accessed differently. And again, we stay grounded here. This is a model, a way of interpreting patterns, not a confirmed explanation. Because when it comes to consciousness, we're still working with something that isn't fully understood. Even at the most basic level, we can measure brain activity. We can observe correlations. We can see what lights up and when. But the actual experience of being aware, the thing that is having the experience, is harder to locate. You can point to brain regions. You can point to electrical signals. But that doesn't fully explain why there is something it feels like to be you. I'm going to say that again. But that doesn't fully explain why there is something it feels like to be you. Now, is this starting to make sense? The Lieutenant Colonel McDonnell isn't sounding very science fiction here. He doesn't even sound like he himself fully understands what he's writing about. Just barely getting the idea of it. That doesn't fully explain why there is something it feels like to be you. And that gap is where ideas like this tend to show up. Not as answers, but as attempts to bridge something that we don't fully understand yet. In the Gateway Report, this shows up as a kind of energy model. The idea that everything, including the brain, operates within a system of vibration, different frequencies, different states, and that under certain conditions, those states can shift, not just emotionally, but structurally. In terms of how information is processed, how awareness is experienced, and if it's true, even in a limited sense, then the brain isn't just producing consciousness. It's shaping how consciousness itself is experienced, filtering it, organizing it, maybe even limiting it. Now, that's where things can start to drift if we're not careful. So let's stay with what we can actually declare. We know the brain changes state. We know those states affect perception. We know external inputs, like sound, can influence those states. That's all grounded. What's less clear is whether those changes in state allow access to something beyond normal perception, or just create the feeling of it. And that distinction matters, because the experience itself can feel expansive, unbound, like awareness isn't confined to a single point anymore. But feeling that way doesn't necessarily mean it's happening in a literal sense. It could be internal. It could be generated. It could be a very convincing shift in how the brain represents space and self. And that's a valid explanation. But even with that explanation, there's still something that doesn't fully settle. Because the consistency of the experience, the way people describe similar states even without shared language, suggests there's something structured happening, even if we don't fully understand what that structure is. And that's where the Gateway report leaves it. Not with a conclusion, but with a model that tries to hold both possibilities. That something real is happening in terms of experience. But the meaning of the experience is still wide open. And maybe that's where it needs to stay for now. Because once you move too quickly towards certainty, you lose something very important. You lose the question. And the question is the part that actually moves things forward. What is consciousness? Where does it exist? Is it confined to the body? Or is the body part of a larger system we're only partially aware of? Those questions don't have clean answers, at least not yet. But they show up in small ways, in everyday moments, in things we usually don't stop to think about, like how awareness feels continuous, even though everything else changes, or how you can observe your own thoughts as if there's a layer of you separate from them, or how, in certain states, that sense of separation becomes more noticeable, more defined, not dramatic, just clear enough to recognize. And maybe those moments don't mean anything. Maybe they're just byproducts of a very complex system. But maybe they're also pointing at something. Not a hidden world, not a secret truth, just a gap. A place where our current understanding doesn't fully explain the experience. And the Gateway Project, for all its structure, for all its attempts to map that gap, doesn't close it entirely. It just outlines the edges. It shows where the questions are, and then it stops. Which is probably the most honest place that it could land. Because if there's one thing that's become clear, the further you look into this, it's that certainty doesn't hold here. Not completely. Not in a way that settles everything. But the absence of certainty doesn't mean the absence of something happening. It just means we're still in the middle of it, still observing, still trying to understand what it is that's doing the observing. And maybe that's the part that stays with you. It's not the report, it's not the terminology, but it's the question, the one that shows up in that quiet space, right before you go to sleep, when your body is still and your senses are quiet, and awareness is still there, just existing, just observing. Because if consciousness isn't tied as tightly to the body as we assume, then where does it go when the body isn't the focus anymore? And maybe there isn't an answer, not a clear one, not yet. But once that question shows up, it tends to stay. Not loud, not demanding, just present, just waiting.